Hello, everyone. This lesson is about mandated reporting for elder and dependent adult abuse. So what is the mandate? Well, mental health providers have an ethical and legal obligation to protect elders and dependent adults from abuse and neglect. So these matters constitute a situation of reportable abuse, similar to what we discussed with the child abuse mandate. And when we're talking about elders, we are referring to any adult who's over the age of 65, so 65 and over. And then dependent adults refer to individuals between the ages of 18 and 64 who have physical or mental limitations which restrict their ability to carry out tasks of independent living on their own, so they have a caregiver. Okay, note that this is between 18 and 64 because once they hit 65, they're considered elders, and when they're under 18, they're considered minors. So this captures that entire lifespan. So the practice of mandatory reporting, just like with child abuse, is designed to encourage reporting of any suspected cases of elder or dependent adult abuse. And therapists are advised to err on the side of caution in reporting. So if you're ever uncertain, you can always call and consult. Your report may help someone who's living in silent depression or is unable or unwilling to seek assistance. It may also help to support and psychoeducate the potential abuser. Okay, so if you have reasonable suspicion of abuse or neglect of an elder or dependent adult, you would file a report immediately with APS, and then you have 2 days to file a written report. Notice that this is different from the child abuse reporting mandate. With child abuse, we're doing that report immediately and then following up with a written report in 36 hours. In this case, we have 48 hours to do the written. Okay. States do provide you with immunity from civil or criminal suits from reporting the abuse, just like they do with child abuse, so long as you're making the report in good faith. I also want to bring your attention to who to make a report with. So I said APS, and that is the case for most situations. There is a slight difference if it's elder abuse or dependent adult abuse happening in a nursing home, but we'll get to that in a minute just to keep you aware. Okay. So forms of elder abuse. So many of the forms of elder abuse that are mandated report are the same as those for children, but there are a few additional forms that we'll talk about for these particular populations, and we'll get to those near the end. So first, physical abuse. It's one that we're already familiar with from the child abuse lecture. Okay, so use of physical force that may result in bodily injury, pain, or impairment includes physical assault, sexual assault, physical constraint. So this would be things like tying an adult to a chair or a bed or locking them in a room. Prolonged deprivation of food or water, which is what it sounds like, keeping them from having the necessary food or water that they need. And inappropriate use of physical or chemical restraint. So chemical restraint in this case would include being overly medicated or given a medication that's not prescribed in order to sedate them. That would count as physical abuse. And of course, the use of like actual restraints to keep someone down would be the same. Okay. Warning signs of physical abuse. So things to look out for as you are interacting with your client and doing your mental status exam, for example. Patches of hair missing or a bleeding scalp could be indicative of hair pulling. Torn or bloody clothing or undergarments obviously could be indicative of some kind of abuse happening. Scratches, blisters, lacerations, pinch marks, unexplained bruises, burns, welts, or any injury really to the body that is either not explained or is repeatedly happening, or the explanations that are given just aren't making any sense. These are warning signs that there may be some physical abuse going on, and it definitely warrants further assessment. Neglect. So neglect involves a failure of caregivers to fulfill their responsibilities of providing an elder or dependent adult with their basic necessities. Now, one thing that's interesting with neglect for elders and dependent adults is that it can be self-inflicted, meaning that you can file a neglect abuse on the client themselves if they aren't taking care of themselves. This would be the case if the client doesn't have a caregiver that's been assigned to them. So they are supposed to be taking care of themselves, but for some reason, either age or some kind of disability, they're not able to take care of themselves well enough, you could file a report for self-neglect, okay? So this might be something like an elderly person is living alone, they're not taking care of themselves, their garbage is piling up, they're not eating, things like that would count as self-neglect. This category also includes failure to have basic hygiene supported. So having uncombed hair, dry cracking skin, they're dirty, foul smelling. They have bed sores from not being turned in their bed regularly enough, which is a common thing in nursing homes. Failure to provide medical care, like not being taken to the doctor, not being given their prescribed medications. Those things would count as neglect. See if there's anything else. I think that's it. Yeah, so all of those things, neglect, mandated report. Okay, so here's an example of how we might see some of these come up on an exam. Okay, a 72-year-old elderly widower is brought for an evaluation to a clinic by his daughters, both of whom live an hour away from where he still resides in the family home. The daughters are concerned that there is no one to look after Dad. When they came to visit him, they found the house in complete disarray. Full trash cans, sink overflowing with dirty dishes, clogged toilet, and no clean clothes. The neurological and mental status exam reveals no dementia. The man is ambulatory, although a cane is recommended. The daughters want to place him in an assisted living facility, but the father is adamantly opposed and wants to stay in his home. The therapist's best course of action is to A. Request a follow-up appointment with the father and make an APS report regarding abandonment. B. Discuss with the daughters the possibility of applying for legal guardianship of their father. C. Respect the client's right to self-determination and arrange for an in-home evaluation. D. Explore the daughter's willingness to have him live with one of them. So take a moment, consider the answer choices and the vignette, and then we'll discuss. Okay, so if we come back to the question here, we have an elder, over 65, brought in by daughters. Note that he's not living with the daughters, he lives independently, okay? So that means the daughters are not necessarily his caregivers, doesn't seem like they are. And it seems like things are not getting taken care of at home. Dirty dishes, garbage, dirty clothes, and all of that. So we're looking potentially at a self-neglect issue, okay? And the daughters want to move him to an assisted living facility, but the client does not want to, okay? So now let's look at our answer choices. A is making mention of abandonment, okay? If the daughters were his caregivers, then this could potentially be an abandonment issue, or probably more so like a neglect issue on behalf of the caregivers. Abandonment would mean like leaving him somewhere. So this isn't an abandonment issue, not really happening in this vignette, so not the right answer. B, discuss applying for legal guardianship of their father. First off, this is problematic in that legal guardianship is something you do for children, minors, not for adults. So the correct terminology would be conservatorship, but I think this jumps a bit and is really ignoring the client's self-determination. It's basically saying, oh, sorry, elderly gentleman, you don't know how to take care of yourself, so someone else clearly needs to. Probably not a good thing to do, not honoring self-determination, jumping to conclusions, plus the term's wrong. Okay, C, respect the client's right to self-determination and arrange for an in-home evaluation. This is the correct answer in this case. So the client has made it very clear he's adamant that he doesn't want to go to an assisted living facility. So you want to honor that and respect his self-determination and autonomy by not just going with the daughters and saying, yeah, you're right, let's move you. But at the same time, you're responsible for assessing for neglect, and in this case, self-neglect. So an in-home evaluation would be a great route to do that. D, explore the daughter's willingness to have him live with one of them. This might be an option for later, but again, is ignoring the self-determination and autonomy piece, assuming that he can't take care of himself, and would probably make the client not trust you anymore. So C is the best answer. Then based off of the in-home evaluation, you could work with the daughters and the client to determine what the next best course of action is. Perhaps living with them, perhaps something else. Okay, The next form of abuse is emotional abuse, and this is the last form of abuse that we've seen explored in the child abuse section, okay? And just like with child abuse, emotional abuse of elders and dependent adults is not a mandated report, but it is a permitted report, meaning that you can report it, but you're not legally obligated to. And just like with child abuse, this emotional abuse in this case does include things like verbal assaults, threats, intimidations, withholding of emotional support, subjecting to emotional distress, so being just really mean and nasty with someone. Also, just like with child abuse, remember that if you suspect emotional abuse, it's really good practice to assess for other forms of abuse as well, as they do tend to coexist, okay? Oops. Isolation. So this is the first of the elder/dependent adult specific forms of abuse, isolation, so not one that we saw with children. And isolation involves restricting social contact. So things like not letting the client use the phone, not giving them access to mail, not letting friends see them, things like that. So in these cases, the adult is not given the option of speaking freely with others or having contact with others without the abuser being present. A sign of this in therapy might be like when you're doing your intake and the the abuser won't leave the elder alone in the room, or if when you ask the elder questions, they always turn to the abuser to see if they should respond in a particular way. Those could be warning signs. Of course, not always, but things to look out for sure. So isolation. Financial or material abuse or exploitation, usually just called financial abuse, which is really common with this population. So financial abuse involves illegal or improper use of an elder or dependent adult's funds, property, or assets. For example, stealing their disability checks, forging their signatures on checks or legal documents so that you can inherit their money or to take their money or have control of their money, restricting their funds, so not giving them their own money that they're entitled to for them to buy things that they want or need, and so on. We might see this through a client complaining they don't have enough money to pay for therapy, or that they're not getting their medication, or they have a bunch of unpaid bills. This could be a sign of financial abuse or exploitation. Things like telemarketing fraud, identity theft, and home improvement fraud also go here as a form of financial or material abuse or exploitation, meaning you are required to report them. These are hard to report because you likely don't have a lot of information, but they are technically a mandated report. So this is a video here that I'm going to share with you that includes a lot of the forms of abuse we've talked about: isolation, neglect, and financial exploitation. It's a video that's used for training law enforcement officers in identifying and responding to elder abuse, and provides us with a real case that allows us to see kind of how this might play out. So let's play it.
So I decided to turn around and have a little chat with him. Hey, you okay? Initially, he told me that he was being held hostage in a basement. A basement? I'm not gonna lie, I thought he probably was a little crazy, but something was going on and I was like, okay, well, let me see if there's some truth to this. He was able to tell me his name, his date of birth, the last address on his license. So he was coherent enough. And he actually said to me, he said, I know I sound crazy, but I'm telling you the truth. I patted him down before I put him in my car. Well, he actually handed me some bent up nails. So he explained to me that she actually took the nails and bent them to lock him inside of the room, and the nails held the door together. At that point, I put him into the unit, and then we proceeded to drive around so we could try to find the house. I proceeded to ask him, do you know what your house looks like? He tells me no, he's only seen the house once, and that was when she brought him initially to the residence.
Mr. Hill had been in the basement, and he could hear what was going on above him, in the house above him. There was a family up there, there was a dog, and he recognized the bark of the dog.
That could be it right there.
Right here. At that point, the dog is barking. He says, this is the house, this is the house. He's pointing at the house. I get out as I make my way towards the residence. I come in contact with Mr. Wheeler. Mr. Wheeler was dirty. He had a lot of, crust and stuff on his face like that. He was walking very slow. It looked like he was malnourished.
And she asked him, who lives in this house?
Do you live with someone in the basement?
And that's when he told her that there was another guy, but he had busted out that morning. And she realized, wow, that this maybe this is true.
Is this Mr. Hill? He came over, identified Mr. Hill for me. At that point, I asked him to show me where he was, staying in the basement. He proceeded to walk me around the side of the house, and we came to a door at the back of the residence. When I saw what I had, I called for some units to help me secure the location because it was a pretty big house. I called detectives, crime scene out so we could get a search warrant, make sure everything was processed legally. So the chain of custody was there.
It was so wonderful that she thought to get a search warrant, to bring a detective to the scene, to bring crime scene out to the scene, to take the photographs and to do everything properly. And that means it was all recorded and I was able to use it as evidence.
While we were out here investigating, Miss Faust actually pulled up into the driveway. She was in an Escalade, her daughter was in the passenger seat. At that point, I did transport her down to CID headquarters.
This is Detective Russell. I'm out at Clifton Springs Manor. I'm out with Johnny Ray Hill. What's the living conditions like where you were staying?
The door is locked all the time until she comes in the field.
Okay.
Which is twice a day.
All right, what about sleeping? What do you sleep on?
One single bed. You should see his damn bed. Yeah, that looks like a damn trampoline for a kid.
What about shower?
It's a aluminum bowl under the table there in the room.
She fill that up every day?
No, about every 2 weeks.
What about restroom?
It's a paint bucket, discarded paint bucket. That's what you do 1 and 2 in. Peeing and shitting.
Okay.
And that's it.
Anytime elderly or disabled people are exploited, it's always about money. The detective was looking not just to see what was happening in the basement, which is where the two men were living, but they also searched the upstairs. He found a bank statement that had Johnny Hill's name on it and also had Chandra Faust's name on it. And she had actually added her name to his bank account and that's how she was able to spend all of his checks. And we have actually had photographs of Chandra Faust accessing his funds.
Now, did you ever talk with her about putting her name on either one of your bank accounts?
Absolutely not.
Did you ever let anyone else have permission to take money out of your account to a debit card?
Absolutely not.
Or did you give anyone permission to write checks on your account and take your money out?
Absolutely not.
The grand jury indicted Ms. Faust on false imprisonment, exploitation of a disabled adult, 2 counts of abuse of a disabled adult, and also 2 counts of theft by taking. She was sentenced to 20 to serve 10, and that means 10 years in custody, followed by 10 additional years on probation.
It felt real good to see Ms. Faust go to jail for what she did. To take someone's freedom from them unwillingly, to me, is very bad, but crimes against elderly people who can't help themselves. She was praying for her own financial gains.
I think the most important thing that Yolanda did was give him some credence. She listened and she investigated what he had to say, even though it sounded a little bit crazy.
I think Officer Shields is an excellent example of what a police officer can do and what a difference they can make. You know, going with that gut feeling that something doesn't feel right and pursuing it until her concern is satisfied.
Elder abuse is occurring pretty much in every city and every county in Georgia, along with throughout our nation. If there's financial exploitation occurring, then usually there's either abuse and or neglect occurring at the same time.
Mr. Hill went into a much better place. It was paid for with his check. It was not a homeless shelter and it was not somebody's basement. I went to see him there and he was very happy. He was able to tell his story and he didn't have to tell it from beyond the grave like he thought he might.
Okay, so there's an example of a case that you may find yourself in contact with. And I think that they made a very important point in that some of the stories that you hear in these cases might seem unbelievable or far-fetched, but it really is our responsibility to take a non-judgmental stance and really listen and assess our clients so that we can help them to get help if they need to, as was the case here. Okay, the next form of elder abuse is abandonment, and this one came up in our vignette practice question. So abandonment is the desertion of an elderly person or dependent adult by a person who's assumed responsibility for being a caregiver. So the important part here is that for it to count as abandonment, the individual who abandons the client must have taken the role of caregiver. Okay, otherwise they're not really responsible for the client. Otherwise, we have a neglect issue, which is what we ended up having in the other vignette. So if someone who's responsible for caring for an individual willfully withdraws care or support without arranging someone else to take it, to step in and provide care, then this is considered abandonment. Okay, this includes dumping at emergency departments, which was a huge thing a few years back, still goes on now, but involved taking an elder or dependent adult to the emergency department saying that they're sick or something, and then once they're checked in, leaving and stopping all contact. When I worked at the emergency department, this happened a lot, and not just by family members, but by nursing facilities as well, because a client was becoming unruly or they were taking too many resources or what have you, they would leave them in the ED and not respond to our phone calls. And this is definitely considered abandonment and does necessitate a mandated report. Okay, just to reemphasize, this is for someone who has a caregiver and that caregiver has stopped providing the service without arranging something else. Okay, then we have abduction, and abduction is the last form of abuse that we're mandated to report for elders and dependent adults. This involves taking a client, an elder or dependent adult, across state lines, so in our case outside of California, against their will, and or preventing them from returning to the state of California. So I've seen this before where an elder or dependent adult will be put like on a train or something to go to a different state. Nothing's arranged for when they arrive, and they have no way, no money, no know-how of getting to get them back into the state. This is considered abduction. A quick note here, this doesn't apply to parents of children. So taking a child across the border without the parent's consent is not considered a mandated report for us. So if your client says, my ex-wife or whatever took our kid, we're divorced, we're separated, they took our kid without my permission, this isn't something you would call CPS and report. You would tell the client they need to consult with an attorney and try to go that route. Okay. Also, I'm not talking about when a child is kidnapped. That's something different. I'm talking if, bio parent, for example, takes the child without other parents' consent. Not a mandated report. Tell them to consult with an attorney if this ever comes up. Reasonable suspicion has been mentioned a little bit here. It's the same obligation as with child abuse. If you have suspicion of elder or dependent adult abuse, and you think that another therapist in that situation, in your situation, would also suspect it, report it. You can imagine making the call to Adult Protective Services or to 911 and what you would say. But at the end of the day, if you suspect abuse, report it. Remember, you're protected as long as you did it in good faith. How do we assess abuse? The same way we do with children. Conduct the session in private. Use open-ended questions. How did you get hurt? Not did your son hit you? Manage your emotional response. Don't make a shocked or concerned or scared face so that the client doesn't shut down. Allow the adult to use their own words, and don't promise not to tell, because just like with children, we will very likely need to make a report. Okay. So what is the process of reporting? So if you have reasonable suspicion of elder or dependent adult abuse, you must file a report immediately and submit a written report in 48 hours. There's the link for it. If the abuse is happening in a long-term care facility, a nursing home, a memory care home, whatever you want to call it, the abuse needs to be reported to local law enforcement, okay? Not to APS, to local law enforcement. If the abuse has happened anywhere else, then you would report it to APS, and there's the number, okay? So long-term care nursing facilities, call local law enforcement. Anywhere else, APS. After the report, just like with child abuse, same process, Document everything. This is your way of protecting yourself. You can also call to follow up on the status of the report if you want. You don't have to. You may be contacted by APS or by law enforcement for more information. And in rare cases, you may be called to testify, in which case you should remember rules about subpoenas and seek out support from your supervisor if necessary. After the report, similar to child abuse, you must decide whether or not to tell the caregiver of the elder or dependent adult. There's no legal guideline for what to do here. Your priority is the safety of the elder or dependent adult. So if telling the caregiver would place them at risk, the elder or dependent adult at risk, you would not tell them because their priority is your safety, okay? So you need to ask yourself whether it might place them at harm, whether it might intimidate the client into recanting the allegations, or it might make them flee. If any of those things could happen and you're worried about them, you don't want to tell the caregiver. Okay, here's our last example, and it's about suspected abuse in a long-term care facility. A patient in therapy reports that she visited her 83-year-old mother in a nursing home and that her mother had bruises on her wrists and bed sores. The patient said her mother seemed fearful and would not say how she got the bruises. The therapist should A, file a mandated report with APS immediately, B, encourage the patient to schedule a meeting with the nursing home director, C, file a mandated report with the police immediately, or D, determine how long the issues have been going on with the nursing home. So take a moment. Okay, so in this case, we have an 83-year-old client, or sorry, 83-year-old person. The client is your patient, and this is her mother. So that's an elder, okay? And the potential abuse is happening in a nursing home, so that's important to keep in mind. And what we're seeing is some potential physical abuse, bruises on the wrists, right, which could indicate restraint, and bed sores, which definitely indicate that someone has not been turned regularly enough in their bed, which can be considered neglect. So mother seemed fearful, would not say how she got the bruises. This, of course, heightens our concern. So we should know after reading this that we're looking at an elder abuse report. There's really no question. So then we need to figure out where do we make that report. And since this is a nursing home, the abuse is happening, the potential abuse is happening at a nursing home, we know that the report should be with police. So that allows us to strike out A. Okay, it wouldn't be with APS. APS would be if it wasn't in a nursing home. B, scheduling a meeting with a nursing home director does not address the immediate concern and could potentially have dangerous ramifications for the client. C, file a mandated report with the police immediately. Definitely seems like the right answer, but we'll double check D just in case. Determine how long the issues have been going on. Doesn't address the immediate concern. Could have negative ramifications for the client. Not a good answer. So C is our correct answer here. All right. Okay, that's it for this one. Let me know if you've got any questions. Thanks, everyone.